Thank everyone for being here. I'm going to ask the secretary to call the roll.
Senator Harper Angel, Senator Higdon,
Is she zooming in?
Senator McDaniel,
Ranger, is she going to zoom in?
Representative Decker, Representative Huff,
Here.
Representative Stevenson, Co-Chair McCoy, Chair Stivers.
Here. For coming out today, I know that I think I have two members. Co-Chair McCoy, who's on vacation. Senator Angel has some sickness in her family, and I think it's been discussed before. Keep her and her family in our thoughts and prayers. I want to, after we do the approval of minutes, do we have a motion for approval of the minutes? Motion, second. Any objection? Minutes are approved. Before we get in the agenda, I want to get this group and people who are in earshot. Representative McCoy and myself have made this clear from the very beginning. There is no preconceived idea or solution to any of this. I had an individual show up at my house the other night, knock on my door, and tell me how there was a solution that was totally repealing the ad valorem tax on bourbon barrels. And I said, where was that coming from? Well, I won't say, but it's not the best thing in the world to come to somebody's house at night to knock on the door to give you information that is wrong. Especially somebody who grew up in Clay County. You don't knock on their door late at night. So I do have some sense of humor. There are no preconceived ideas or notions about how this will conclude. I do not know how many times that the two chairs have to say this before people understand there is none. So whoever continues to spread that idea that there is some utopian fix out there, I wish they would stop. It allows me to sleep better instead of getting knocks on my door late at night. I'm sure others on the task force have heard that. I know it's political season too, so everybody likes to do things for politics. Well, in 26 years of being in the legislature, I've yet to run a negative ad. Can't say what other people have done, but at some point in time, the dialogue has to be such that you think about the issues and answers and not the politics. The ultimate goal that my co-chair and I have stated is to do something that does not hurt locals but creates a different economic dynamic to allow job growth and expansion and increased tax base. So with that, we're going to move forward with today, and I'll say this. The importance of this industry and the impact it has in a very positive way. And I had my colleague who was in the majority in Virginia here yesterday, and he was in Nelson County and Bardstown, and he was saying, wow, these are some really wonderful schools and wonderful facilities. How do they afford to do that? If I'm not badly mistaken, the Nelson County school system gets $5 million in ad valorem tax from bourbon barrels. I said, probably somewhat related to the tax base that's been created by a good economic environment. And we want to see that continue. And my colleague from Virginia was really surprised about that. And we had a long discussion about that issue. So with that, we are going to continue to have discussions. We are going to continue to understand what the facts are as it relates to impact of a move one way or another, or no move at all on the overall economic and taxing dynamics as it relates to the bourbon industry. So, the first person we're going to hear from today is Eric Kennedy.
Thank you, Chair, President Stivers, and members of the task force. I'll tell you, all of my in-laws are in or near Clay County, and I don't even go visit them without a whole lot of warning first for them to know I'm coming. And even when I give them warning sometimes,
Especially not at 10 o'clock at night either.
especially not even at noon on Thanksgiving, I give them plenty of warning first. Thank you all first. Thank you for thank you for forming this task force and working on this so much over the interim. And thank you for making time and making sure that on behalf of all of our school board members, superintendents, and district leaders, that KSBA has been given time this month to come talk about some of these issues. I think a lot of ground has been plowed already in the previous month's testimonies from different groups right from the beginning. So I'm not going to replow any of that. A lot of what you have heard from some of the other groups on how the tax works, how this is assessed and collected, applies the same for school boards as it does other localities that tax cities and counties and so forth. So I'm not going to redo any of that. Just know that a lot of that is the same for us. However, some aspects of school board property taxes and finances are really unique. So that's what I'm going to try to focus on fairly briefly today. You just give me the warning on time because I could talk about SEEK and property taxes all day long, and I would if you let me. I used to work when I was on the A&R committee staff years ago. This is some of the exact work that we did there, so I love talking about it. Some of those school-specific issues where we are a little bit different from other municipalities and localities are what we see on the screen that I'll talk about. The nickel levies, the nickel taxes. Probably everybody in this room knows a lot about what that means. Plenty of people out in the world that might be watching this don't. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what nickels are, how they are restricted, and how that revenue is used in districts. You can see there KDE, the Department of Ed, has something they update every year or two called the Nickel Facts. I linked it there. It's publicly available on their website that really goes into detail of what school boards have these taxes, how much they generate, and so forth. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the SEEK calculations. I think from the very first meeting of the task force, representatives from the industry, I think it was the KDA, they presented some analysis they had done on sort of the net impact. I believe that was if the entire assessment, if it was just repealed and exempted, what that would do, how the SEEK formula would flow through for districts if all of their local assessment and tax collections were taken out on aging bourbon, and what that would mean for their SEEK amounts. That I believe every single district except maybe one on that showed that even after the SEEK went through, there would be a net negative impact. I'm going to show on a couple of slides just really briefly sort of why that happens and why that is. Also, there's a great research report. It's a little old now. The LRC staff, OEA, did a research report called Understanding How Tax Provisions Interact with the SEEK Formula. The numbers in there are a little old. It's about 10 years old. However, explaining this entire interaction of what taxes school boards impose compared to like where that comes from in the assessment and how the SEEK formula interacts with that. It's a great report. All of that information is mostly still current and relevant. A lot of that hasn't changed since then in the law. So I linked to that as well. This is a well-worn copy, highlighted. I'm going to have it buried with me because I'm in it all the time. This is complex, and even I myself constantly have to say, gosh, I have to read that again and remember how this works. We're going to talk a little bit at the end about the importance of 100% fair cash value assessment of all property in school districts to ensure fair funding from the state across school districts. As we talk about the SEEK formula, that will segue right into that, because the fundamental basis of almost all state funding that goes down to districts and the local money they raise is almost completely tied to the property assessment, the value of property in the districts. That is sort of a proxy for a lot of things. The state government, you, the General Assembly, giving more or less money to districts based on many things, special needs of students in the districts, fairness of how much you give so that ultimately we want as close as possible to the same amount of money ultimately spent on education in every district in Kentucky. So many factors of all this formula ties back to the full fair cash value assessment to capture that fairness so that, we talk about property rich and property poor school districts. That is just the proxy that we have chosen for decades and decades to measure how much money you should give to communities. So that is why, more than any other tax, there are more restrictions on property taxes in Kentucky because of the Constitution. It's the oldest tax that we have, and because that's almost the only tax that school boards can really use. It's the main primary tax school boards use, and because the value of the property forms the basis of all of these state funding calculations, it is just especially important that we really look closely anytime we're going to exempt any class or kind of property at all and what that would mean, and that all of the PVAs that assess most of the property and some property that's assessed at the state level, like Bourbon is, it's so important that that is fairly and accurately assessed, or unfairness will result. And then I'm going to close at the end with something that I believe several of you have brought up. I know President Stivers, you have mentioned before in discussions, kind of a similar thing happened also, about 10 years ago now, 7 or 8, 10 years ago. A similar thing happened where a large class of property, it was not exempted and the tax was not repealed, but it just all at once, very suddenly, the assessment of what it was worth was decreased. And that class of property is isolated in a few areas of Kentucky. And I'm going to talk about that as an example of what sorts of things might happen to the tax rates, the amount of money collected on property in the districts, and the SEEK formula in comparison to the kind of thing we're talking about here. I have not.
Eric, let me stop you so
Yes,
people
sir.
understand what that is. Certain minerals became unminable, unmerchantable, even though they had been taxed as mineable, merchantable under the unmined minerals tax, devaluing the property tax values for about 38 counties at a minimum, which impacted the SEEK formula.
Yes, sir. The way that the state, and it's very similar in a lot of ways, the state centrally assessed what the value of unmined coal primarily was worth to tax it at the state and local level. And so very similar to this is the Bourbon is sort of centrally assessed up here at the state level. And so when the value of that changed a lot, substantially, suddenly, all at once, the collections decreased and the SEEK formula kind of didn't account for that. And several slides, I'll really talk about that and why I'm bringing that up as sort of a comparison to explain the kinds of things that might happen when any class of property, especially where one district has a lot of it and it's a lot of their budget, changes. So I don't have a lot of slides. What you see on your screen now and in the handouts, this is in the year 2014. The school districts shaded in blue were the districts that had any aging bourbon stored that was part of their assessment and was paying taxes to these school districts. So in 2014, you see there were, I believe, 14 school districts that had some of this property we're talking about in their district. It was assessed. It was part of their assessment base. They went into the SEEK formula. They got tax collections directly from it. I bring this up. I'm going to show the expansion, the wonderful success story, the expansion of the industry, not only more and more of the bourbon distilled and aging in these districts, but then on the next slide, moving and having more of it stored in other districts since 2014. I went back to this to pull some of this information because I believe that was around the time, just in a prior work that I did here at the General Assembly, this issue has come up before. Of course, we all know. It has come up even before the non-refundable tax credit tied to this was created several years back. I remember some research was done around this year, maybe in 2014. There was the same sort of analysis. The nonpartisan staff looked at what would the impact be through the SEEK formula if all of this was just repealed kind of all at once. And I remember at that time, there were just relatively few school districts in that list of like the Bourbon school districts. And we looked at, there was all other things staying constant. There would have been like a small increase for some in the state SEEK money, a decrease for others. The same kind of thing that we saw in the first meeting of the task force. I remember doing it back at that point. Now on the screen, these are all of the school districts shaded in the year 2021 that now have some of this bourbon stored there, collecting tax on it. So, of course, it's expanded. There are now about 29 school districts in the list. And so if we toggle, I mean, that's really the story. If you kind of quickly toggle on the screen, you can see the expansion. As I said, not only more and more of it in those districts, but moving out and more warehouses being built in more school districts. So this is sort of the group we're looking at now of districts that are the ones that might be impacted if any sort of change happens to this now. And of course, depending on what that change is, and depending on any approach that you might take to reduce the negative impact in any of these districts, we have to assume that if it continues to grow, which everybody hopes, I mean, I want every industry to grow in every school district. If it continues to grow, there might be additional school districts kind of coming online where new warehouses are built into the future. I mean, I think everybody hopes that that happens. So looking at another 7 years into the future, this same chart, many more districts might be shaded that would fall under this situation. Now back to the topics I'm going to talk about today. The first one was the nickel taxes. These are those bourbon districts, I'll call them, that have nickels. And so the nickel taxes are, as for the folks that aren't too familiar, special permission for local elected school boards that have taxing authority to impose a tax rate of approximately 5 cents per $100 in value on real and personal property and motor vehicles, I believe, I'm almost positive. And the money that comes just from that portion of the tax rate is restricted to buildings, facility work directly to pay for facility work or debt service on a bonded project. And so those nickel taxes, many more districts than you see here have nickel taxes. Some have several rates devoted to the facilities work, and it's restricted for that purpose. These are just, again, going back to kind of all the bourbon districts. As you can see, almost all of them have one or more of these nickel taxes imposed that is collected on everyone's real property, everyone's house, all the land, tangible property, including the bourbon that we're talking about. So to talk a little bit more about the impact, that's one of those things where I don't, county governments, fiscal courts don't have something quite like this nickel tax we're talking about. That's one of those specific school things that's unique to us. This is showing, this is one school district's, one of the bourbon district's actual SEEK calculation chart, kind of the most current one that's available. An entire portion of every district's SEEK calculation chart is all about the nickels. So you'll always see, you'll pull up one district's example, you will see if there's any amounts there, you'll know that they have one or more of that kind of nickel levy. They are collecting this much money at the local level that's restricted to usually debt service or projects. So you'll see there's some of the nickels are equalized with state money, some are not. So you see in this example, I've highlighted 2 of the nickels. This one bourbon district has, I believe, 1 recallable nickel. And the FSPK, that's the first one. Every district has to have the FSPK. So every district has one of these nickel rates. So as I said, the districts that I highlighted in blue have gone over and above. This district, for example, has 1 recallable nickel. That means that at some point several years ago, the school board voted to impose this tax rate on the property, to devote it, the proceeds to facilities work. When they did that, it was subject to recall. So the voters, all of the voters of that school district could have circulated a petition, gotten enough signatures, put it on the ballot, and then had a vote in the community to possibly recall that tax and not impose it. This tax, frankly, I didn't go back and research. That either didn't happen or they passed and successfully imposed the tax and it was not recalled. Ultimately, it's in place. The reason I highlight this is that is a very important part of the overall discussion, because for all of those bourbon districts that were highlighted in blue that have 1 or more nickels, many of them have already estimated what they think that will generate over a long period of time to formulate their bonding capacity. And many of them have already issued a bond tied to some specific projects, and the revenue from the nickel, the local direct tax revenue, and the state equalization is going into the debt service to pay off the bonds. And so that's always something that we really want to be cautious anytime that anything is changing about property tax, the values, the assessments, if anything's going to be exempted from property tax locally. We always want to be cautious about how will that change the amount actually directly collected from that, which is restricted into debt service mostly, and also the state equalization amount.
Eric, can I stop
yes,
you
sir.
right there?
Yes.
Giving you the correlation between that and the unmined minerals tax when you project it out on a 20-year bond issue. that you were going to have an unmined minerals tax that was coming into the school system. Then it becomes unminable, unmerchantable because of the circumstances around. That removes the funding stream. But you're in year 10, but you still have 10 years left of the bonding, but you have removed one of your components of the funding stream, which makes it harder to continue that bond payment.
And you got to continue it, or you're going to be in big serious
Even though
trouble.
you have revenue loss.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's like a mortgage. I mean, you can't go back in time and not issue the bond. You're on the hook for those bond payments. That's exactly right. The state amount you see there, we sometimes call it matching money, but it's never a dollar for dollar match, but that's the concept. So the state will give some money to kind of give additional money and support to districts that have these nickels. The amount of what the state gives is based on not only the sort of the per pupil assessed value of the property in that district, but how that compares to the statewide levels of sort of per pupil property assessment. And so I mention that to say that just like the rest of the SEEK formula, if, for example, a sizable piece of the assessed value in this district was repealed and exempted, the local amount of revenue would absolutely fall for these nickels. The state equalization amount there may or may not increase to sort of make up for some of that. That would depend also on what is happening in all the other districts and at the statewide per pupil assessed value level, where we set the level of equalization that we're sort of bringing districts up to. That is hard to estimate when you're trying to estimate out the impact of a proposed change in that at all. So I just wanted to say the $940,000 amount, if you did just repeal the Bourbon in this district, would fall. The $565,000 probably would increase in some amount, but we don't know, maybe not enough to fully cover that. And they might have another net negative impact, but then they're still on the hook for the bond payment. So now kind of to the second bullet point back on the opening slide of kind of the second topic, moving beyond nickels, which was mostly just cautioning us to all keep that in mind of what impact it would have on nickels and debt service. The two things highlighted on the SEEK chart now, I wanted to explain why in the very beginning there could be this net negative impact on what a district gets in state SEEK money. It is true that if the local assessed value of taxable property in this district falls, if you just took out all of the Bourbon, that the function of the SEEK formula would be, if everything else stayed the same, if the number of students stayed the same, the number of at-risk students and everything else, if all these other factors stayed the same, that's the only thing that changed, that the state amount of SEEK funding probably would increase in some amount to take to kind of backfill that. That's kind of the point. But however, the reason why in none or almost none of the districts was there kind of a total net wash on that, there was this net negative impact, is because where you see the highlighted yellow thing that says less 30-cent local effort, the SEEK formula that's calculating to sort of give them a little more money because their assessment fell is based on if their tax rate was 30 cents per each $100 of value. Well, every school board is over 30 cents. That's like the state floor minimum required level. For many reasons, every school board is actually imposing a tax rate that's higher than 30 cents. So the delta, the difference between their actual tax rate that they're collecting local money on and the 30 cents that it goes into their SEEK formula, that is the net negative impact that we would talk about mostly. And in this Bourbon district, we can see that the levied equivalent rate highlighted, approximately in this year, the actual rate that they're sort of imposing is 69.4 cents. And so that big difference is that sort of the net negative that we would be talking about. In other words, this district, they are basically imposing around 69 cents per each $100 of value on all this property we're talking about. I don't like to discuss nickels.
There's questions, and I don't want to come back to this type of complicated question like 10 minutes from now when we've lost.
I don't want to go back about nickels now even, but I will.
Look, it's one of the most amazing things I've seen in 26 years up here is nickels. Senator McDaniel had a question.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Mr. President. So, Eric, what I want to make sure that we're getting at here then is with the 30 cent, in essence, being what we go to for the state's recognition portion of that, the district would recognize a total difference of the amount of the assessment times 0.69, SEEK would only recognize the amount of the difference times 0.3. So consequently, that 0.394 times the revision downward would be what the district would be on the hook for. Is that correct?
I believe so. Yes, I think that's correct. That's how I understand this would work. And I think that basically is the net negative impact that we talked about at the first meeting, all those amounts. That's why there is that net negative, because the SEEK formula would help backfill a little, but not all. So, yes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President.
All right. Don't ever take us back to nickels. I hate talking about nickels. I wish, if I could get in a time machine, we would go back and we would have thought of something different than nickels to do school facilities work way back then, but now we're trapped with it. And we're at the point now, it's almost essential if a district is looking at any major work at all to have at least one of these nickels. At this point, they're all recallable at this point. Difficult to get enough support to get one. But I will leave that. So again, I'll just say all of the factors on this SEEK calculation chart, I talked about this Wednesday at the full Appropriations and Revenue Committee. Again, like I said at the beginning, the importance of the fairness across districts, how important it is that all property is fully assessed at fair cash value. That's been the entire fundamental basis of all of this formula from the beginning when we created this in 1990. In fact, part of the CARA reforms was restating again in state law that all the property must be assessed at the full fair cash value, that was so important for support across the state for CARA and roughly the tax increases in it. Part of that legislation, that same session, the day before the legislature passed CARA, they passed a separate bill that made it the penalties on PVAs for not fully assessing property were much stiffer. They could be removed from office by the Department of Revenue. They put in all new annual audits and checks that PVAs were doing the job fully and accurately, because people in one part of the state knew that now the state will give our schools more or less money compared to other districts. And if our PVA is fully assessing everything and another is under assessing, that's not fair. So that's why I said there's always more restrictions and more complications about any property tax change compared to other taxes, because the importance of that being the basis for you see the box on the screen of SEEK inputs. I mean, about half of the inputs that go into the formula tie back in some way on this assessment, the value of all this property and what's being collected locally. The local effort, the reduction in state funding, how the formula works on the calculation. So you see, we start with like the $4,100 per pupil. You add on some money for how many kids they have at risk, how many exceptional children they have, and so forth. You're adding all of this amounts up, and the state money going down to the districts, you're adding it up, getting bigger and bigger. Then you reduce the state funding based on that 30-cent local property tax effort. So there again, that ties back to make sure that is fair for all districts across the state in the SEEK formula, and that you don't give districts more than you're giving someone else unfairly. It is so important that all the property is assessed fully. A few years ago, there was a bill proposed that passed that exempted, I believe it was recreational vehicles held in a retailer's inventory for sale. It added that one sentence to the list of things that were exempt from local taxation. And I remember the fiscal note on that bill said, well, how much of that is there in Kentucky? Seems relatively small and minor. There's not a lot in many of these districts. It seemed like not a big deal. But KSBA and other groups cautioned even then. They said, well, we are sort of opposed to any new exemption of anything, because even at a small level, you start to skew the real picture of how much activity, what's the economic activity, how much wealth is there for a local district to support itself that ties into what the state's going to give them. So now moving on to the unmined coal kind of comparison example. What you see on your screen now, and to back up a little bit, many years ago, basically as long as there's been a state of Kentucky, a Commonwealth of Kentucky, there's been a property tax. Unmined coal and all the unmined minerals under the dirt, under the ground that have not been mined yet, that has always been treated as a form of real property that was subject to tax, just like your house and buildings that you own and farmland. Several years back, I think there was some litigation that was challenging, are we actually assessing that property accurately? Is it paying what it should be paying? And the result of some of that was a formula that you see on your screen. Maybe the only thing more complicated than the SEEK formula was how we assessed what unmined coal was worth before it was mined while it was still in the ground. There was this, and this has changed since then. At the time, for several years, this 7-factor formula was how the Department of Revenue in Frankfort centrally assessed the value of all the unmined coal in the state. You see what those 7 factors in that formula, you multiplied everything together to get to what was the taxable value this year. And roughly half the factors, like mineable acres. Is it mineable at all? Because it's worthless if you can't mine it, as you were saying. Coal thickness, coal density. Some of those we're trying to capture how much coal is there. And is it taxable at all? Because if it's not mineable, it has no economic value. It's kind of worthless. A couple of the factors near the bottom we're trying to get to, well, in dollar figures, what's it worth? So that was trying to capture in the current economy, how much is this worth for us to send a tax bill, just like we assess how much is my house worth this year. So this factor, it was the outcome of some litigation. I think everybody settled and agreed on it. This is what we used for a while. At a certain point, I believe, is it in my numbers, around 2016 or so, 15 or 16, many of us know the overall market for coal, the industry and the economic market for coal really plummeted. And a lot of the folks that own this coal under the ground, I think, protested their assessments and said, well, this formula, it worked up until now, but really, suddenly, a lot of other factors have suddenly skewed the entire market. The coal that I own under the ground is not worth this much anymore. It's technically feasible to mine, like I could mine it, but no one will buy it. The real thing just came to, I can't sell it. Like the prices have plummeted, I can't sell it, so I should pay less tax. It's not worth as much now. So when that kind of protest came up, there was a new look at it, a new assessment. The Department of Revenue, which I will not speak for them, and I know about this much about what actually happened, but they kind of came out with new assessments. And they were dramatically reduced, just hugely, substantially cut the value of what this unmined coal was worth for tax, like all at once overnight, basically. What you see here, this, because as we all admit, usually the single largest item on a property tax bill is the local school district. And then probably after that, the fiscal court, then health departments and soil and water and other things are smaller amounts. And so when that happened and the tax bills went out and the assessments went out, the school districts were hit especially hard, along with the fiscal courts, in some of the coal counties in western Kentucky, but especially in eastern Kentucky. And so overnight, KSBA heard immediately from school board members and superintendents and finance officers, truly like a panic. I mean, I remember at the time, I actually worked on A&R staff here at LRC at the time when this happened. A lot of superintendents called their legislators, so you all called staff at the time and said, we almost can't believe what's happened. What are we going to do? Like, how are we going to backfill this money? For some districts, it was like half of their total local revenue and half of their budget. It was this huge sudden hit. That is, at the time, a news article in the Harlan Daily Enterprise that was on Christmas Eve in 2016 that said they had just been told of the shortfall that might cost $300,000 or so in the district budget. It was like in the middle of the year. They had, as you said earlier, they had already estimated a lot of things. You estimate 1 or 2 years out on some of this school budgeting and SEEK and revenue numbers. It was truly a crisis. And then you see there, Knott County, these are just a few that I had readily available, Knott County schools, unmined coal tax revenues from 2013 to 2018. You can see it was a very stable source of revenue for them and a lot of their budget that went from in 16, $1.2 million to $65,000 in 2018. I mean, that's like a huge emergency crisis for them. In Pike County, a similar measurement, in Pike County, the contingency fund in their budgeting, they shouldered this when it hit Pike County largely through like backfilling through their contingency at the time. And you can see what it did to that, falling from $7 million down to $300,000 or so. And so part of the response to that at the time, which again, remember when this happened, legislatively, you did not like repeal this tax or exempt this tax of this property from taxation. The change was truly just, it was not worth as much suddenly. One of the ways that we, that you, the General Assembly, we are very grateful for in 2018, in the state budget in 2018 that you passed that session, you gave sort of a one-time, one-year amount of funding to these districts, roughly based on that, like the one-year net negative impact that they had, to sort of give them a lifeboat, to give them some time for their local taxes, their rate setting to kind of play out, and to try to increase the money they were collecting from all the other kinds of property. And I'm drawing near to the end, even though I could talk all day. You don't want to hear me talk about this all day. It's mind-numbing. This chart is looking at Leslie County, the Leslie County Board of Ed local tax revenues. In the last meeting of this task force, a couple of folks, I think a couple of members and some other folks, trying to wrap your heads around the compensating tax rate and what that means, and the tax rates that school boards and other localities can set. Along with the idea for us that SEEK might backfill some things, it came up of, well, I believe someone said, does it matter where the money comes from? Can't you just take the compensating rate one year and then you'll bring in the same amount of money from all the other property that's still taxed and all the other taxpayers? In some ways, that's true. What the compensating rate is whatever rate you would need to set this year based on what your assessment is this year to get about the same amount of money that you actually brought in last year. So technically, and just looking at the screen, when Leslie County in eastern Kentucky, when the unmined coal assessment drop happened, that school board between 2016 and 2017, the amount that's like an orange color on your screen is the amount of money they collected from mostly unmined coal. It went, as you can see, that tells the picture. It was a very consistent amount that was about half of their local tax collections, about half of what they had worth anything taxable there was this unmined coal, and it went down so much that we call it, I speak in terms of it was almost effectively repealing it. It went down so much so suddenly. And so the orange amount between 16 and 17 dropped. And so for them, the Leslie County School Board that year legally, technically could have set the compensating tax rate, and you would have thought the amount in blue on all the other property will just increase and they'll get about the same amount of money that they used to get from the amount in orange. But practically speaking, financially, that school board knew that if they had set that tax rate, that many of the taxpayers in that county, when the tax rate on their tax bill that year jumped so substantially, they couldn't have paid it. And you can't really, there's not a way to pay half of your property tax bill. You get one bill to the county sheriff at once, and you kind of just pay all of it or you don't. A lot of folks probably just would not have paid at all, and they would not have really been able to backfill because it was so much. It would have like doubled everyone else's. Now, again, this is an example, a comparison to the kind of situation, the kind of thing we're talking about. I don't believe that any district has like 50%, any of these Bourbon districts, it's this much of their local budget and revenue as it is in this example. But this is trying to explain how the compensating tax rate works. And it would work the same way if any sizable amount of property was reduced this much or exempted or repealed. So for them that year, I remember once I was just speaking to a superintendent, not even at KSBA in my prior job. A superintendent called the day that a man named Che Ritter at the Department of Ed sent that school district all their rate calculations. And he called me and he said, I'm just looking for help from anybody. Our compensating rate's double, and we can't do that. Nobody will pay it. Like, what in the world are we going to do? Which again fed into the legislative response we were grateful for, to give them kind of maybe a couple of years to phase into something. This is my last slide. This slide explains kind of that phasing in, that the compensating rate can sort of, how that can work. Another of the counties hit with this was Knott County. The Knott County Board of Education's general fund real property tax rate in 1718 was 50.4 cents per $100. Now that was already the first time they set a rate after this change hit. And so that was the rate they set in the year after they said, well, like our budget, has been substantially dropped. We've lost most of this unmined coal assessment. And so SEEK, we'll get some SEEK increase for that, but still not enough, as we discussed earlier, to fully backfill this. And so their compensating tax rate that year was much higher than 50 cents. And they sort of said, well, practically, we probably won't be able to collect that. That's such an increase for everyone else on their house. They set this rate. And then the following year, they had the life raft. They got about $1 million, I think, in the 18 budget to kind of help fill this. Then that went away. And in 1819, the first year that they are totally under this new assessment, they're looking at their tax rate options. There was no ongoing state sort of special money. They set the rate at 58 cents per $100. That was the compensating rate for that year. And so just this one increase, the actual increase in the tax rate on everyone's tax bill that they got was actually a 15.07% increase between those 2 years. And so, as again, I say the 50-cent rate was not even the compensating rate. That would have been even larger. Then the following year, when they're trying to like slowly phase in and kind of fill this gap that's opened in their budget, just to sort of be at the new normal level, was still a 15% rate increase for each individual taxpayer on their bill. And so this kind of explains that if any change is big enough in a assessment base and the rates, it does very much matter like who the money comes from. It matters of, will the other people be able to pay it practically? Will you have enough of a stable tax base on everything else? And will the tax increase on everyone else be something that is just practically feasible? That's just one snapshot of what it looked like there. And again, so then you go back to the Bourbon districts that were shaded in blue. This is the kind of things they would go through and the kind of calculations and decisions they would make anytime if you did. And I've told no one that you have already decided to repeal. I've been talking about what this task force is looking at. But in explaining that terms, if that is something that happened, if you just passed a bill and said, well, this tax is repealed or all this class of properties exempted, in some of those Bourbon districts, this is exactly the kind of thing they'd look at of, well, even our compensating rate would be a substantial increase. Is that fair? Is that feasible? If we just set that, will some people actually be able to pay it? We may end up not collecting about the same amount. As well as the nickel calculations we talked about, how is that going to change the amount they're bringing in for the debt service for projects that may have already been finished? They're like, 10 years into a 20-year bond paying it off, but the project's long been finished. They're in a building using the building. You can't go back and just not build it. The very last thing I'll mention before I open up for questions or move to the next part of the agenda is, as part of these discussions, a lot of us have talked about hold harmless, and we use that term. I've met with several members of the task force and talked about, well, you may or may not pass something, and whatever you do, we don't want to harm localities. We'll do something that's holding you harmless or hold harmless. I think that term, there is no one definition of what that means anywhere in a statute. In some ways, that could mean different things to different people. Some people have suggested, well, we'll just take kind of a one-time snapshot in time of, we'll calculate all of this, the net negative impact, and we'll just give you that amount of money from the state permanently or for a few years or something, and that'll like hold you harmless so you won't see a net negative impact. We would just caution strongly against that approach, because in other taxes where we've done something similar in the past, it has not turned out well for various cities, counties, schools, and localities. Also, when you compare those first two slides, if you just take a snapshot of who is collecting this tax now today, you may not capture growth for those districts into the future, and you may not capture the growth of the industry moving into other districts. So 5 years from now, a warehouse might open and a school district might not get a benefit from that in their local revenues, and they might not be in the hold harmless group getting state funding. And then full circle, if anything like that were to happen, the ultimate fairness of the whole purpose of SEEK, the formula of SEEK and what SEEK is, the whole purpose of it is that you give more or less to different districts based on the measurement that we have picked forever, the proxy of local wealth and local economic activity being property assessments and the value. It is always important to really be carefully considerate of any exemption you do, big or small, of any kind of property. And is that going to skew it? Is it something that's in one part of the state but not another? So then is that going to skew that now you give more or less to some but not more or less to others? The fairness, that is from day one of SEEK, including to this very day. A lot of people complain about SEEK because of that we're a SEEK winner, we're a SEEK loser, but it is what we're doing now. But this entire concept of any class of property being assessed or not and paying tax or not really goes right to the heart of things you'll hear from people, not just like school board members, but you'll hear from the taxpayers that yell at the school board first, and then they come yelling for everybody else if there's any sense of the district next door got something we didn't get and something's not fair. So that's just a big thing that, again, it's unique to schools, even different than counties and cities and other folks, that's a part of this issue. That's all. I don't know how much time I've taken, longer than you probably wanted. I'm sorry.
No, I think it's very good that you have gone through this, but I want to just take a minute or two, then I've got a couple of members who have questions. The dynamics in the eastern part of the state, I think I know fairly well. And through that, I think the realities were that minerals weren't mineable or merchantable because we went from $300 million in severance tax receipts to $25 million in severance tax receipts, basically. And I think everyone in the room that's affiliated with government knows that we're, as a nation and a world, apparently attempting to go away from carbon-based fuels, which means even less value to coal, oil, and gas. Out of that, which I want to go through this, expansion is a good thing, according to you, because that creates increased property values. So from what happened in 2014 and 15 in the bourbon industry, that barrel tax that was placed on an additional new 6 million barrels that have come into existence has helped those counties where they have come into existence. So to not grow actually has multiple economic impacts in other areas, which then I'll go back. When you lose property value, you lose jobs, you lose ADA for your school system because people move to where jobs are. You lose general property values because most people can't afford to pay the property taxes. And when you walk into the Leslie County Courthouse, which I have done many times in 32 years, you see the majority of the docket being taxees versus Robert Stivers to collect where they have purchased all the delinquent tax bills that I have failed to pay. I'm going to use, I pay my taxes, but I'm using that so nobody else, I don't want to pick somebody else because I've done that before and then somebody complained to me that I use them. Yeah. So, the dynamics are there. So you want good economic dynamics for business and industry to grow. If you want to see what happens when you don't, go to Leslie County, because they're now at 10,000 people when 15, 20 years ago they were at 15 or 17,000 people. Childbearing years, people who work are virtually the same universe. They move to Scott County and live with Damon there, and work at Toyota. And that's kind of the circumstances. So I want people to understand, we're looking at all the economic dynamics, and there's much more to this than just what you spoke of in that, because I'm very familiar, and I know Senator McDaniel, can't remember what we put in the budget, those lifelines. I think there was 18 school systems we had to do that way, somewhere around there. But with that, I just want to kind of go back and explain that. And I have Senator McDaniel who has a question or two.
Thank you, Mr. President. Eric, could you go back to the start of the nickel explanation? Just start over for us. No, I'm kidding. No, sincerely, I actually was going to kind of echo what President Stivers alluded to there, which is in the case in the East, I think the economic dynamics that drove this were largely, in addition to the unmined sources, you also had an outflow of population, and consequently you could look at a corresponding reduction of student population. Now, I don't know if the districts looked at trying necessarily to right size, or if they could based off of geography, etc. But there was necessarily that. The flip side of what we're talking about here is you should necessarily have increasing property values and an increase of population and economic base occurring in the areas because of the nature of this activity. And I think the President and I are playing on the same string there. I just didn't know if you had any particular brief comments on that.
Yeah, I think that's true. So, like I said, in the areas where this is expanding, that's also some of the areas especially along some of the interstates where just population is growing and expanding, as you said, and other things are growing. So that's why really it's difficult to the point about like a hold harmless snapshot. Well, it's difficult to even do the things we're trying to do here of taking this snapshot to say if everything else stayed the same, what would the impact be of this one change? Because the ADA numbers in the SEEK input chart probably would grow unless there's some other thing happening. The per pupil assessment then might also change, that the total assessment falls perhaps if everything else stays the same and property is repealed or exempted. But then on a per pupil basis, that might change if population's growing. So a lot of things will play into trying to estimate what would the exact thing be that we're trying to replace. To your point, Senator McDaniel and Senator Stivers, another thing that's sort of similar for us that we've already discovered that we don't need to replow is IRBs and pilot agreements that we talked about in the last meeting. I looked at one of them recently, yesterday, one IRB for a distillery expansion and warehouse expansion in one of the Bourbon districts has a pilot from several years ago. And that was captured in the full write-up of that agreement that the school board had in front of them to approve or not, which they approved, was exactly what you're talking about. It was like, well, here's what we estimate for the next 30 years. If this project happens, we will probably see this much increased property tax, this much increased property tax on the liquid that's going to be a part of this. And so here's what we lose from this, and here's the pilot, but then this is what we'll grow in. All of that, as best you can estimate, all of the growth in student population and all the assessments is a part of what they do look at when they look at these things. But it is difficult. I mean, it's crazy to think if everything on this chart stays the same, let's change one thing and try to guess what will happen. I mean, that's all you can do, but nothing ever stays the same. Every single number on all of these charts changes every single year for every district, like 3 times a year. We run the whole thing at least 3 times a year, so it's tough.
Thank you, Mr. President. Eric, I agree with you on the SEEK formula and the nickels. It's all I tell people all the time. It's clear as mud. It's very difficult to comprehend at times. Under the, I guess the General Assembly appropriated this year $4,100 per student SEEK formula, and I think I saw one of my schools gets, and as the formula goes and this money is calculated, the ad valorem tax, I think I saw one of my school districts with about $2,900 is what they got, or $3,000. So about $1,000 a pupil less because of the local resources. And we talk about backfilling. So if the ad valorem tax went away, then somebody, I guess the state has to backfill that formula to get those schools that are now getting $2,900 to, if that's part of the reason. It's not going to be the entire $1,100, $1,200, but it'd be a big part of it. Do we know? Have you looked at how much it will cost the state? And I assume I'm right on that. The state would have to put extra money in to the SEEK formula to backfill those dollars. Is that correct?
Yes, I think the best way to speak to that or answer that is, again, if nothing changed except that, and then you were like going to rerun the SEEK calculation. And that's really what the KDA analysis, the distillery analysis in the first meeting when they looked at that was doing. And it's kind of had most districts have this net negative impact. So that's really kind of what that was doing. So you could, KDE could sit down and run that again, for the current year and all the current numbers. I think there again, let me bring it up again. What you would really be looking at is for the district you gave the example of where we start with 4,100, but then at the end of the day, the top is 4,100 at the bottom of the page. They only get maybe like 3,000 actually is what they receive from Frankfurt per pupil. That gap, a big part of what is driving that gap is then looking at what is their actual local tax collections and their local rate, which is one of the other things that does change every year. Would especially change if something like this happened because like the compensating rate thing we talked about. So calculating that, of course you can rerun the SEEK calculations assuming everything stays equal. It would be sizable. It's all relative. It's a lot of money for the state to cover all of this, but that means it's the same amount of money for all these districts if they were to lose it and need it filled. And President Stivers was exactly right. When you drive through any community and there's new school buildings, they look really great. mean, if you're from out of town and you're driving through, you either think, wow, they really put a lot into their schools, or wow, they really don't. Look at their schools here. They're pitiful. And in some places, as you said, they're great because we have a growing tax base and it's paying taxes. It's paying into a nickel tax that they've imposed and they're using for a project that built the building. I don't have the numbers to sort of quote the numbers to answer what your real question is, but that's what you would do.
Well, thank you. And it'd be different for, I think you're using Marion County numbers there.
You know your districts very well. This is Marion County.
69.4 cents, and you're only going to backfill it for 30 cents on the SEEK form, I think is what you said. Mm-hmm. So anyway, it'd be interesting to see what that number is. And like I said, maybe they did explain that number in the beginning, but not as thorough as you have.
And plus it would change. I mean, it would change every year. So it's also difficult to really know that everybody agrees this is the one perfect calculation and analysis chart, because it's going to change constantly anyway.
I'm right. I'm correct. It's clear as mud. Thank you.
Any other members seeking recognition for the purpose of answering question? All right. Eric, thank you. Appreciate the presentation. I'm sure a lot of people who don't deal with the nickels every day, the equalization nickel, what is there, like 4 different nickels we have to deal with?
At least, but please keep dealing with them until we replace the whole concept with something else. Please pick up the new nickels, if there are any that aren't recalled between now and the next budget. Senator McDaniel won't even laugh about that, but I'm just going to back away. I'm going to back away real quick.
No, none of us that have dealt with the nickels for very long laugh about nickels. Thank you, Eric. Next, Eric Gregory, Tim Eifler, and Dr. Coombs. Dr. Coombs, you have not been here before in this task force. The other 2 gentlemen have been here, so I'm not expecting too much from them in the way of additional information. But again, introduce yourselves and wanted to talk a little bit about the economics and some questions that have been raised over the past several meetings.
There we go. Yes, thank you, Senator Stivers. And my apologies again for missing the last meeting. As Senator Higgy pointed out, I did have COVID, but I appreciate all the well wishes that came in. And I am hopefully back to fighting condition. And thank you to this task force. As Senator Stivers stated, we agree that, and we applaud y'all for creating this task force and undertaking this fact-finding mission to bring all the parties together and hear all the input in an open and objective way. And we understand that's a big if solutions are to be examined, I think it's great to do it as a group here than us just working individually. So thank you to this task force. And really quickly, before I turn over to Tim Eifler here, who's an expert in SEEK formula and taxes and things like that, I think Mr. Eric before me really hit on some of the themes that we're talking about here today. I was here in 1990 when CARE was passed, and I'm not sure if we did it all over again, we'd tie education funding to any industry that's subject to market forces and economic whims. The bourbon industry is an industry that is used to forecasting 5, 10, 15 years out, and we are under the same external pressures as any industry right now in the terms of supply chain and workforce and glass shortage and barrel shortage and everything else. But one thing is clear to us, and we've stated this here, that competition is real. And other states understand that bourbon isn't just a drink, it's economic development and tourism and tax revenue and jobs, and they want what Kentucky has. And right now, states are growing faster in the distilling community than Kentucky. You've heard us mention there are 2,300 distilleries all across the country now in all 50 states, and Kentucky has less than 100 of those. And one of the big reasons is the tax structure, the barrel tax on spirits, which no other place in the world taxes. So we think it's right and proper to be looking at this, because there is going to come a day, and hopefully not in my lifetime, where this brown water isn't as popular as it is right now. This year alone, There's stories that just came out that tequila has gained 70% on sales on American whiskey and vodka. And this year, for the first time ever, Americans will be buying more tequila, spending more money on tequila and agave-based drinks than whiskey. So is that the start of a trend? We don't know, but we're closely watching this to see what happens to the future of our industry. So with that, I was turned over real quick to Tim Eifler here for any comments or any questions on some of the issues that he has talked about before.
Let me just pose this not for an immediate response, but to plant the seed for thought with you and Eric. If I'm not badly mistaken, there's about 12 million and 12.5 million barrels of bourbon currently aging somewhere in there in the state of Kentucky.
11.5 million, yes, sir.
Okay, 11.5 million.
Yes, sir.
I'm off a million. Sorry
Yeah,
about that.
sorry.
That's based on a projection, and as we've looked at the charts, nothing is sold within the first 2 years. And then as you get to that 6 to 8 year point, that which is produced in 2022 will get sold. The majority of it will get sold because that's the target years for considering prime product. And so you'll see that. So let's say in 23 you have market projections that the bourbon industry is going to start declining because various reasons. Take whatever you want to plug into the scenario. It's vodka, it's tequila, it's rum, it's something else. It may be that we become, back to Prohibition years.
You just made my heart jump.
I know.
Sorry.
But there's just a
Correct.
change in buying patterns.
That's correct. Yes, sir.
That happens on occasions, that you have changes in buying patterns. And you all project that, well, wait a minute, we're going to cut back. We're not going to be building rick houses. Actually, we're not even going to fill rick houses. I.e., let's compare it to the coal industry. What happens if you see that type of decline, that you no longer have product being produced, jobs being created, value being added?
You just teed up Dr. Coombs, I think, perfectly.
I didn't know what he was going to say.
So, yes. No, that's something that Dr. Coombs has looked at. So we can go straight to Dr. Coombs. Unless, Tim, is there anything particular? I will say that Eric's numbers that he suggested, Tim, again, is an expert in this, and he had done the calculations that y'all saw earlier in the year, and they line up pretty well. Correct, Tim?
Correct.
So we're on the same page on that. So, Dr. Coombs, I'll just turn it over to you. Sure, or I don't mind doing it. I'll let you go.
Let me drive.
Okay, you can drive.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Paul Coombs, retired economics professor from University of Louisville, and have been doing economic studies of the distilling industry since 2009, roughly, so 14 years. Every 2 years, we've done updates of our economic impact study, and it's just gotten deeper and deeper. And I've become more educated about the supply chain and the tax structure and the modeling issues. And all of those reports are on KDA's website if you want to go there. And I've been watching these task force hearings on YouTube, like lots of other people. Very fascinating, and making notes. And so today, I'm just going to present some ideas that I had as I listened to your all's discussions over the last few months. We've also done some projections of phasing out, et cetera. And Senator Stivers, your mention about the 2-year lag and withdrawal rates, we have those calculations ready to go if you want to hear about that. So let me just take you through a few ideas that I had in response to what has come up so far. You mentioned the current inventory. There's not only the current inventory, but also you can see the exponential growth in the inventory beginning in the early 2010s. We're now 11.4 million barrels at the end of 21, an assessed value of 5.2 billion. So just lock in the big picture, and I'll come to this slide again at the very end. I've only got a few here, so this will not take long. This is from our last study, and you don't need to look at the details there, but basically we've tried to calculate all the taxes paid on the production of distilled spirits in the state over the last decade. And let's just focus on the growth over the last decade. And you can see it's gone from 68 million to 167 million over that decade in state and local taxes paid due to the production of distilled spirits, which is 144% growth. Obviously, it's continued in 21. We just haven't done another study in the last year. We have never gone into the further weeds to look at these other taxes, utility taxes for the schools, which have not been mentioned so far, which are significant, I'm sure, for distilleries, insurance premium taxes, some do, some don't, corporate state income taxes, room taxes, and restaurant taxes. Another one I didn't add to this is the benefit to agriculture. The last time we did our study, we found that Kentucky distillers bought about, I think it was about 12.5 million bushels of corn, Kentucky-grown corn. So just to give you a feel for the impacts. Here's the revenue history for the aging barrel tax. You can see the state gets a very small piece. By far the largest beneficiary are the school systems, and then the other local jurisdictions, as were mentioned, the county fiscal courts, fire departments, libraries, health departments, soil conservation. But schools are the biggest with 26 million. So this year, we expect the Department of Revenue estimates that state and local jurisdictions will receive almost $40 million from the aging barrel tax. But look at the growth, which is very consistent with the growth that I just showed you in the inventory. The amount of money coming from the aging barrel tax has tripled over the last decade. All of this discussion to an economist reminded me of the famous Laffer Curve, and the industry, Eric, just made the case.
Let me stop you.
Yes.
You may want to tell what the Laffer Curve is. It's
So
not
I'm-
something that's laughable, but it is Art Laffer, a very well-known economist who lives in Nashville now, has a farm in Burkesville, and I think was President Reagan's chief economic advisor. So, and he created the Laffer Curve.
The concept was well known to economists, but he made it famous by drawing this on a napkin and convincing Ronald Reagan that lowering taxes in that case might lead to more tax revenue, not less. And that's why it's become famous. And Eric just made the point that the industry could be at that tipping point. I don't know that, but industry people are saying the competition has gotten stiffer. Other states are honing in on our business, our share of everything, really, the number of licensed distilleries, employment. Payrolls have held up pretty well. Employment's been falling. Our share nationally has been falling. So we could be. And what the Laffer Curve tells you is if you're on this downside of the curve, then lowering taxes like this actually gets you more tax revenues. So obviously this is very complicated in practice because there's so many taxes that distilling pays. But conceptually, I think that's the point you're making. That's what it sounds like to an economist, that if you could give us some tax relief, because we do stand out as a very high tax place for distilling, we could actually grow even faster, or at least faster than we would have, and generate more tax revenues.
And I want to go through this theory a little bit.
Okay.
With that, you look for people, and you see this primarily in the higher tax states, that businesses are moving out and going to lower tax states, primarily on the consumption side, sales tax side, versus the production side, which is your income tax side. And that's actually where you are seeing the growth. Therefore, you're maybe reducing a tax, but you're expanding the base. The base is going exponentially greater than that in the reduction of tax revenues. Fair?
That's the concept, and it's certainly happening. And Kentucky, thankfully, has started shifting direction you just pointed out, which is lowering our income tax burden and raising the consumption taxes, which most economists would agree that's the direction to move as far as economic growth.
Senator McDaniel has a question.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dr. Combs, good to see you again. I think the last time we saw each other, actually, we spent a Saturday with Art Laffer
Yes.
talking about tax policy.
Yes.
Help me to understand, because you bring his curve in, either I'm not understanding or we're looking at two different theories here. The x-axis in this is related to the tax rate, not necessarily the net tax dollars collected.
Right.
I've not heard in previous testimony from the industry that necessarily the rate is the problem so much as the accumulation of the credits. Am I incorrect in that? Because the curve necessarily reflects tax rates, not tax receipts. And it appears, so far, what I've heard is problem with receipts, not rates. Am I missing the point? Is there a rate problem as well? The local taxes are going up more than you guys necessarily care to bear? Or is this an actual receipts problem?
I think this is a pretty high level curve, obviously, but I think the concept is that if you look at all the taxes that the industry pays and divide it by their economic activity, that's an effective tax rate. That the aging barrel piece really stands out because no other place does it, right? And so by taking that tax rate to zero, which is the proposal, you would lower the overall tax burden on the industry, lower their effective tax rate across all tax categories because you eliminate one of them, which then gives them more incentive to expand. The industry would expand more in Kentucky. That's the concept.
Sure. I guess the utilization of this particular model, though, raised the question in my mind: is there an issue that you guys feel like local taxes are being unjust, or local taxes are being raised? The actual rate, not the dollars that you're paying out, but is the rate being raised by the local governments, the local school boards, the local fire districts to a point? Well, let me finish my question, please, just real quick. And if the slide answers it, that's great. But I've heard the conversation more is about total dollars being paid, not necessarily about a rate issue. And I want to understand, if we have an issue that's not been addressed yet, do we need to have some people come address that separately? I guess that's more my question here. I guess probably more of an industry question.
I have somewhat of an answer to that coming up, so
Very good.
thank you.
Thank you.
So over the last month or so, I've tried to roll up the actual county revenues in some of the core bourbon distilling places and look at distilling share of the total local tax contribution, including the schools. And I've got a couple of examples. It gets messier when you get into some of the other counties, so I picked on two that had smaller population where it's more easy to see. I'll just give you the punchline because we only have a few minutes here. If you look at Marion County, best I can tell, the distilling industry has raised, really quadruples its share of the revenues to the fiscal court over the last decade. If you look at the school system, it's almost tripled its contribution to the school system. So definitely in Marion County, best I can tell, which is obviously a core distilling county, distilling over the last decade has become a much bigger part of their tax base. If you go to Anderson County, which is another less populated than, say, Bullitt County or Nelson County, it's also pretty clear here, gone from about 7% to 13% of the fiscal court's revenues, and for the school system from 6% up to about 13%. So let me get to Senator McDaniel's question while it's fresh. I also look back historically at the tax rates in some of the core distilling counties on real estate and tangible property to see how they may have changed over the last decade. And what I see, particularly on the tangible personal side, which is the rate applied to the aging barrels, that a lot of the counties have lowered their tax rates significantly. And then in the case of real estate, I noticed that several of the counties have very low real estate property taxes rates, right? You can see Jefferson as a benchmark, or the state as a benchmark below. Those three real estate tax rates there for Bullitt, Marion, and Woodford are dramatically lower than the real estate tax rates in Jefferson or the state, and the baseline has not changed. So there is an indication. I'm not claiming cause and effect. I'm just, as I said at the beginning, these are some things to consider that I'm noticing and listening to your conversation that caused me to check things. Now, why these counties have been able to lower their tangible personal property tax rates, I'm not absolutely sure. One possibility is it's because distilling has caused so much growth in the tax base that they've been able to lower the rates on everybody. It's a question more than it is a conclusion. And I'll just mention here at the end, another factor that we've not considered is the growth in the hospitality industry. Most of the tourism websites in the region prominently feature distilling, tours, the Bourbon Trail, etc. And they are seeing strong growth in their hotel rooms, in their restaurant sales, and also tourism jobs. So I took a look at the hospitality industry employment in 6 core counties in Bullitt, Franklin, Marion, Nelson, and Woodford, and broke the last 20 years up into 2 halves. I stopped it before COVID because everything fell off the cliff in 2020. But if you divide that period in 2, you can see that before the bourbon boom, this core area was adding employment and hospitality at the same rate as the rest of the state. But in the last decade, dramatically higher growth. And it lines up very well with this. We're up to about 8,000 jobs in those core counties. To me, it lines up very well with the billions of dollars that have been invested by the distilling firms in their production facilities, in their tours, their tasting rooms, the whole package that they use for tourism. And the result is strong growth. And so I guess my point is there are tax revenues flowing to the local governments other than the core distilling operations and the warehousing operations. They're also getting job growth, some cases occupational tax growth from the hospitality jobs, but also room taxes and restaurant taxes for many of the cities. So that's all I have. I know we didn't have much time today.
No. Okay.
You know I love this stuff.
I know it. I do too. I get into it.
I had spoke to the Society of CPAs the other day. I told my daughter, I said, I'm going to go spend the next 2 hours talking with a bunch of accountants about tax policy, and I thought it was exciting. And she said, that sounds awful. So, all right. So let's think through the problem in the East that Eric raised earlier, Kennedy. Obviously, little different scenario. And God forbid, we never want to see an industry end up in decline. But, consumer choices being what they are and consumers being fickle, these things happen, right? And hypothetically, I wonder, what is kind of that tipping point where too many eggs are in one industry's basket as it relates to the overall tax revenues of any given jurisdiction? Because I do remember, Presidents, I remember sitting in the conference room with school district budgets in our hands saying, what are we going to do for these people, right? Okay. And I certainly don't want to sit there again. And, it's kind of like, especially when you're on the exponential portion of a growth curve, it seems like an impossibility. But as, the President's region and many others found out, all parades come to an end. So, is there a hypothetical, is there an equilibrium point past which too much revenue from a single industry could be potentially catastrophic for a taxing entity?
I don't think the analogy with coal works quite so well in the central part of the state. It's more diversified economically, population more stable, and as the CAECO person, Mr. Henderson, I think is his name, said last month, I think the line was, if you've seen one county, you've seen one county. They're also different. Maybe Marion County would probably, of all these, would probably be the most exposed to being a one industry county, dependent upon, would you agree, Eric? But you take a place like Bullitt County, it's absolutely booming with logistics and warehousing centers. Population growth is very strong. It's part of the Louisville metropolitan area. So, they have a very, very diversified and strong growing economy. Nelson County, much more diversified and strong and bigger. So it doesn't smell like it's as vulnerable as Eastern Kentucky was to the coal industry to me.
But you're exactly right, Senator. That's why we're looking at this as well, because we don't want to be in that position where if for some reason the industry took a downturn like they did in the 1970s and 1980s when consumer tastes change, that schools are losing money and counties are losing money because we're not filling as many barrels or we're not dumping as many barrels out there. So we want to attract more distillers here to increase that tax base to make up for that.
May I have one more, Mr. President?
Please.
Thank you. And Eric, specifically, you weren't able to be here last time and make a response to a question that I asked. But a lot of these taxing jurisdictions feel as if they went along with IRB. I don't mean schemes in a negative term, but structures.
You're right.
Based off of the anticipation of bourbon barrel revenues, and there was a bit of an offsetting factor there, and felt like there might be, not deliberately on the front end, but at this point, a partner in a transaction who's not upholding their end. How do you mitigate the feeling and the impact necessarily of previous analyses that were done for those kinds of jurisdictions?
I think you'd found the industry to be willing partners to work with the local communities on those. Those are contracts. And as far as we know, those contracts would be honored. But if there is a solution, I know going forward, I think Judge Eisen mentioned that the IRB with IJW in Shelby County includes an escape clause on there. So if the barrel tax did go away, that the IRB would go away. But I think that you would find that the distilling partners in those communities would like to work with their local communities if this happened to figure out a way to honor those contracts.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. President.
Representative Huff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have a kind of a comment about what we're discussing. Of course, I'm from Bullitt County, so we're seeing a real explosion. Right now, we've got 32 new warehouses, rick houses coming up. I know you've mentioned that in other states, they're now producing the bourbon and that a lot of places want to go there. And they can do that. Of course, like if they go to Texas, and there are bourbon places in Texas, it's too hot. I mean, the color's wrong, the flavor's wrong. It's got to be made. I mean, it's just too hot there. But one of my points was, in Anderson County, I think Buffalo Trace had planned 24 new rick houses. And I don't know if it's because of the possibility of they might not get their revenue, but now they're filed suit to stop them from doing it. So if we want to attract the industry to our area, but yet we take away the incentive, they might still go to another place or another state.
I think you're seeing in some of these areas as the industry is growing so much, and you're not going to put a warehouse in an urban area anymore. You're looking at this, that a lot of this is becoming land use issues, and whether or not the local communities think that distillery warehouses are proper uses from an agricultural standpoint in those communities. And that's for every community to decide. And Anderson County has certainly been a point of controversy right now. And the same thing goes in Franklin County and Henry County, for example, as well. So those are situations that the local communities are working through right now. We would like to be able to expand and again, add jobs and investment in those counties. But ultimately, it's going to come down to, in some of those, a land use issue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Higdon.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I guess I just want to you kind of describe Marion County as a one industry community. I'm going to take exception to that.
I said the most vulnerable.
Well, it's we're proud of Limestone Distillery, Maker's Mark, and Diageo. They're great corporate citizens, and we're very proud of them. But we are a very diversified community. In fact, per capita, we have more jobs in manufacturing than probably any community in the state. So we've been blessed with a lot. But it would be an absolute tsunami if this 16% or these tax dollars went away for Marion County and Nelson County. Between the two, half the world's bourbon is stored in my Senate district. And I keep saying that, but I think the economic impact on Marion County would be about $6 million a year, and Nelson County $9 million. So about half the tax dollars that's collected through this tax go to those two counties. So I did want to defend my Marion County, though.
Senator, actually, thank you, and you actually helped make my point, I think, because I don't think that scenario applies to Eastern Kentucky. When coal went away, they did not have a manufacturing base, and they still do not have much of one. So the central part of Kentucky, I think, is much more economically healthy and diversified than Eastern Kentucky, when coal started dwindling.
Well, I guess the backlash is kind of the same for that increase in property tax for the other citizens is obviously a concern, whether you're in Eastern Kentucky or in Central Kentucky. It's an increase in property tax is an increase, and it's always very serious. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have a comment more so than a question in looking at those counties and their property tax rates going down. And I'm also wondering, sitting here, as we all know that property values have gone up so much, we've all seen what's happening. I would love to see what the actual revenues are, not necessarily that rate, because I would almost bet that those incomes are about the same, if not even more, even though the rate's gone down. Property values have risen so much. So I would like to see those actual numbers.
Well, we've got it for two of them. There's Anderson and there's Marion. If you look at the top of the chart, see the real estate and tangible personal property tax. Those are the actual revenues to fiscal court. And then you can see also the school system revenues. And we've got it for every
So they
county.
did go up, even
Sure.
though the rates went down.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And that is almost the Laffer Curve articulated. Am I right?
It's certainly correlated. Causation gets harder.
I understand that. Do we have any other questions or comments from the group? I do want to say this. Senator Higdon has defended his area, but diversification is very much needed in a lot of areas, and I don't think people really understand an Eastern Kentucky dynamic. It's really interesting to study from a sociological position and an economics position because it was so dependent on coal. And actually, at one time in this state, severance tax alone generated close to 20%, Senator McDaniel, of all state revenues, just severance tax. You think about that 20% of our budget came from one tax alone, which did not include income tax, corporate tax, sales tax, that ripple effect, Dr. Coombs, off of that industry. It's quite amazing to think that in the 70s, that's what it generated in the peripheral jobs and the ripple effect, but there was no diversification of the economy. So you go from a Harlan County having a AA baseball team with the New York Yankees to being a county of 90,000 to a county of less than 30,000. But we'll go on to another topic. Thank you all. I think we have to wrap up Jennifer Hayes on our own staff to kind of give a recap about kind of the industry taxes that we've heard. Don't think, because she's at the very end, that this will take real long, because we've heard some of this. It's just kind of to bring it back together.
So once again, I'm Jennifer Hayes, Committee Staff Administrator for Appropriations and Revenue, and staff to this task force as well. I'll give a shout out to the LRC economists that was sitting beside back there in the audience, because they track anomalies, things that are strange out there in the universe. And so this is going to be strange because A&R staff is sitting here with a one-page presentation. So if you cannot find it in your packet, look for the one piece of paper that is colored, has colored pictures on it. So this is very strange. Just let me say that once again. But you're absolutely correct, Senator Stivers. We continue to get questions from legislators and questions from the public about the different taxes that are paid by this industry and the requirements for those taxes. And so what I hope to give you is a one-pager that you can take away that in pictorial form will give you just enough facts to understand where in the industry that these taxes occur. And so if you'll remember back to the very first meeting of this task force, I sat here for an hour and a half explaining those different taxes and the credits and various aspects of this industry. And we really got in the weeds. And so I'm trying to bring you back up out of the weeds, and just a refresher of that first discussion is what I hope to do today. So if you remember, our tax system is built on the three-tier system. We have the manufacturer, we have the wholesaler, we have the retailer. Those are the three tiers within the system. We have added a fourth tier through the direct shipper. When you look at the manufacturer, wholesaler, and retailer, and the fourth arm as well, there are taxes that are very similar across the members within the industry and similar with all other businesses in Kentucky. The first tax that is similar, the similar taxes are in white boxes on your handout, so that's a key. The first similar tax across the industry is state income tax, as well as other businesses doing business in Kentucky. So state income tax, 5% of net income. Just bullet points related to the tax. So very quick, we're going to run through this. The second similar tax is the local occupational license fees. At the business level, these local occupational license fees are generally those paid by the business, and they are based upon a certain percentage of net profits. And the manufacturer, the wholesaler, and the retailer, if they are doing business within a local jurisdiction where those fees are imposed, the business would pay that. You'll notice that that box is not there for the direct shipper. The direct shipper is an out-of-state company, generally, that does not have property and payroll here in the state, and so those local occupational license fees will not apply to that direct shipper. The next thing that is very similar across at least three of the industry partners is the state and local property tax. Remember, this is both real and tangible property. It can be at the state level, it can be at the local level. Of course, the local property tax is what we've been talking about. Once again, it does not apply to the direct shipper. They don't have property in this state as a general rule. The thing that becomes different, now we're entering the colored box stage of the presentation. The thing that is different is the manufacturer is required to pay the ad valorem tax on barrels and distillates. Remember, that's 5 cents per $100 of value. And while there is not anything that the General Assembly can impact upon this next box, it's most interesting to talk about because the manufacturer is also responsible for paying a federal excise tax. I think the excise tax is imposed upon the warehouseman. That's the owner, proprietor, or custodian of the bonded warehouse. So that federal tax is paid by the manufacturer, not paid by the wholesaler or the retailer or the direct shipper. The next tax that is different is the state wholesale sales tax, 11% of gross receipts. This is only paid by the wholesaler. Remember, the wholesaler is that big building. I was able, when I was in Denver, to tour a wholesaler of distilled spirits while I was out there at the NCSL meeting this summer. Huge building, conveyor belts. They pick the product, through all these cases and fulfill the orders that are going to the retailer. So there is a purchase from the manufacturer, a sales from the manufacturer to the wholesaler. They purchase that product, they have it in their warehouse, and then they pick that for orders to the retailer. So the state wholesale sales tax, as that wholesale sale is made, 11% of gross receipts. The direct shipper, let me point out, the direct shipper is acting as that wholesaler in a transaction that comes into this state. So they are also paying the 11% of gross receipts. The state alcohol excise tax is the second alcohol tax that is paid by the wholesaler and the direct shipper. Remember, that's $1.92 per gallon for each gallon sold. And then finally, only on the wholesaler is the case sales tax, 5 cents for each case that is picked up from the manufacturer, sold to the wholesaler. That case sales tax is paid by the wholesaler. Then we move on to the state sales and use tax. That is a retail tax on the goods and services consumed in this state. That is a retail tax. While the duty to collect and remit is imposed upon the retailer, you do understand that the consumer pays that when they purchase the good or the service from the retailer. So I go in, I buy $75 bottle from a retailer, then I am paying 6% on top of that sales price. And the retailer collects that from me and remits it to the state. The direct shipper, if they have met the provisions to create nexus for sales tax purposes, remember they are out of state. So if they meet those thresholds, they are also collecting the 6% sales tax for sales that are directly shipped into the Commonwealth. The next thing is the local alcohol license fees. Local fees imposed on the retailer, which can be based upon a certain percentage of gross receipts from the sale of alcohol. That might be a retail store like you see the picture. It might also be a restaurant that is serving drinks of alcohol. There can also be a license fee that is a flat rate, an annual dollar per year, or there may be regulatory fees that are also imposed for policing, which are also a percentage of gross receipts. So once again, depending upon the local jurisdiction within which that retailer is operating, there are several different local alcohol license fees that may apply. And then finally, we have the employees who are working throughout this industry and compared to all other industries. So that employee is responsible for state income tax. Now, I think in the prior presentation you saw that There was a line on the chart that said payroll taxes that are remitted. Yes, the manufacturer, the wholesaler, the retailer, they do remit those taxes, but they are actually withheld from the employee's paycheck. So the employee is actually paying that tax. It's just being remitted to either the state or the local jurisdiction on behalf of the employee by the employer. Withholding is that process. If that withholding requirement were not there, that money would be given to the employee in their normal wages. It would not be withheld. The employee's paycheck would go up, but then the employee would be responsible for paying the state income tax or the local occupational license fee. So the withholding requirement is a means of assisting the employee to pay that overtime and ensuring compliance with the income tax laws. Now, that was very quick, but I hope I've accomplished a one-pager here that will help you understand the various taxes, where they occur, when they occur, throughout this industry and as well as other industries in the Commonwealth.
Thank you. I do have one comment and then one question. When preparing a color photo for us, if you would please use a Kentucky corporation on your distribution truck instead of a Jack Daniel's Tennessee Sour Mash whiskey truck, it would be greatly appreciated.
I tried. I really did. But if you go out on the internet, all the Kentucky ones are copyrighted, and so I couldn't do it. I'm sorry. I couldn't grab it from the internet. So
valid point. Valid point.
It is a Kentucky corporation, though. That makes sense.
Actually, it's owned by a Kentucky corporation.
Right.
Brown-Forman.
Yes. So.
Let me ask a quick question that I don't want an answer to because I think it's going to take some time. Mm-hmm. The dollar for dollar offset in state income tax that was passed in 2014, I think became fully or 100% in effect in 2019. Mm-hmm. But I heard a comment that due to the reduction of the corporate tax and some other things, it was not fully accessible or fully utilizable because of that. So is there a possible way to see from full implementation today to today what has not been utilized in those tax credits over the 3-year period? I don't think you just have that off the top of your head.
No.
But if that could be determined, I would like to know that number and what is not being utilized or projected to be utilized this year in those tax credits.
And to fulfill that request, I would like to turn to the industry to see if I can use your data over time. Do you have data that goes back to 2014? Because the Department of Revenue...
Well, and if we need to make a request of DOR, I don't mind doing that.
Okay.
And we will sign NDAs if necessary.
Okay.
But I would like to know that number. Senator McDaniel, no, it was Senator Higdon that had a question. Oh, both. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. President. You asked pretty much the same question that I was going to ask. We've been operating on the 30 million is about what we thought the tax was, and when this one presentation here says it's 39.5 million, and then I guess I was curious when we did this in 2014, the distilleries were going to get, I guess the ad valorem tax back in the form of a tax credit. And as Senator Stivers asked, I was just curious how, I've heard different figures. One of them, I have a hard time believing that we're I guess giving back that little as what we actually thought this would cost. So I guess along with what the Senator Stivers asked, that information would be very helpful and very good. Thank you.
Thank you for the work on this, along with our staff, the House staff, and putting this together. Do we have any other comments or questions from any of the members? Then I will say this, Representative McCoy and I will get together in the next few days to kind of discuss a path forward. I think what we have tried to do is not to create a battlefield of conflict, but to set the table for a discussion that is collaborative to see if there are some potential solutions here. I think we have shown to try to have produced information that shows the impact, positive and negatives, and what would happen in various scenarios, and the ad valorem tax on bourbon barrels. But we have also seen the positive impacts of changing the tax structure and economic dynamics with the TDAs in 14 and 15, of how changing a rate may actually grow your base and increase your overall collections. And I think that has been kind of mentioned here with the Laffer Curve, and then I think almost reflected in some of the documents that Dr. Coombs did. But we will, I suggest, and once I get with my co-chair, we will put this out in a more formal way, of people thinking about how we work in this collaborative forum to see if there are some potential solutions to aid and assist the industry to grow even more without having negative impact on localities. So if there is not any other discussion or members seeking recognition, we're adjourned.